Alright, in this video we're actually going to finally jump in and start writing some code. So that should be lots of fun. Let's
I'm
first...
looking forward to it.
Actually, you know what? I'm lying, actually. Let's take one more step back. Just one, just a really tiny one. I
All right.
promise we'll write some code very shortly here.
Okay.
I just want to show you guys what's going to happen if I try to run this application. And then I was thinking, wait a sec, I never really showed anyone how to run the application.
That is true. We should do that.
Yeah. Okay, there's going to be two ways that you can do that. Well, there's actually quite a few ways. If I right-click on Simple Blog, the project, not the solution, and I scroll all the way down to Properties, I'll see here under Web the different choices I have for web servers. Now, in order to host the application for development purposes, we need an actual web server, right? We need a web server so we can actually see the site,
Yeah.
so we know what we're doing. And we'll see down here under servers, we have a bunch of different options. We have use the Visual Studio Development Server. We have use local IIS web server. We have use IIS Express. And we have use custom web server. We're going to be using IIS Express. IIS Express is a web server that functions almost exactly like IIS. Remember, IIS is the web server that we're going to be deploying to. It's the production web server. IIS Express is a development version of that web server that gives us all of the features and functionality of IIS, but packaged in a more developer-friendly way.
Okay.
We could use an actual IIS web server, which I have one on my local machine, which I could use, but we're not going to. But we would do that by unchecking this checkbox. We can also use the Visual Studio Development Server. This is a legacy component. IIS Express was introduced in the last couple of years. Before that, we only had the Visual Studio Development Server, which really, really, really sucked.
Okay.
Okay,
So let's not use that if we can help it.
yeah. So instead, we're going to be using IIS Express. Okay, so we're going to use IIS Express. So how do we launch IIS Express? Well, there's two ways to do that. I'm going to close out our projects, our project properties, and I'm going to go up here to debug. We have two options of running our project. Start with debugging and start without debugging. The way that we are going to be working mostly with this application is to start without debugging, or Control F5. That will launch the web server in the background and still allow us to edit code and recompile our project while the web server is still running, which is nice. If we start debugging, however, we'll get the normal Visual Studio debugging experience attached to our web server. We don't really want that because then we'll have to stop debugging when we need to make modifications, and we'll have to start it back up again, and it'll be a mess.
Okay.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Start Without Debugging. From this point on, when I say Start the website, I mean I'm hitting Control F5. If I say Debug the website, I mean I'm hitting F5.
Got it.
Okay, so Start Without Debugging. What that's going to do is it is going to do two things. First of all, it launched a Chrome window, pointed to localhost at 64292, just a random port that it decided to listen on. We'll see we get an error. We'll talk about why we're getting an error in a moment, but that's expected. The next thing that happens is IIS Express launches. We see it down here on our taskbar, or our status area, I think it's called. If we click on it, right-click on it, sorry, we'll see all of the sites that are running on this web server. We see that Simple Blog 1 is indeed running, and this is its location.
Gotcha.
So now we know that IIS Express is running, so we can refresh and we get a server error. If we didn't have IIS running, so let's show how to stop the website. Obviously, we can't stop it from Visual Studio because we started as external process. It's not like we were debugging it. To stop it, we simply right-click on IIS Express. We can say exit, or we can go into this specific site and say stop. If I stop the site, harder.
Really, really hard.
I think it's thinking. Okay, let's just exit out of IIS Express. So I'm just going to right-click and hit exit. Then it says, do you want to stop all worker processes and exit? I'm going to hit yes. Now IIS Express is no longer running. If we go back to our Chrome window and hit refresh, we no longer get a server error. Instead, we get a browser error saying that it couldn't even connect to anything. That's because there's nothing to connect to at this point. So I'm going to go back into Visual Studio and I'm going to hit Control F5. And now our web server is back running. It's running our web application and we're getting a 404.
Which we expected to get.
Exactly. We don't actually have any code inside of our project that would make it be anything other than a 404.
Yep.
So that's IIS Express. I'm going to leave that up running continuously throughout this project. And if it ever stops, all you got to do is go into Visual Studio and hit Control F5.
All right, way to go. I like it.
Okay, so let's talk about one of the most fundamentally important aspects of ASP.NET MVC. And that is routing. Unlike PHP or web forms, well, web forms now support routing because they took routing from ASP.NET MVC and moved it into ASP.NET and then exposed it to ASP.NET web forms. But typically web forms in the past didn't have any routing. PHP doesn't have any routing. Cold Fusion won't have any routing unless you build it into it. With ASP.NET MVC, routing comes as a part of the framework. It's actually a part of ASP.NET itself now. And what routing means is it's the way to describe to the web server what path goes to what controller. Remember that diagram I had open that I'm really hating myself for closing?
Yeah, the ASP.NET MVC up at the top, that you had the arrow down to the controller, the routing's going to be somewhere along that arrow.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
Our request from our browser goes into the web server. The web server spools up ASP.NET. ASP.NET spools up our global ASICs. Our global ASICs spools up ASP.NET MVC. Then it tries to figure out, okay, so we're going to a particular URL. What controller needs to be invoked? And that's what routing is. Now, if we go into our route config, we see a couple of routes already written for us. The first one we have is routes.ignoreRoute anything that's .axt. AXD is a special extension for files that don't actually exist on the file system, but are used for debugging purposes. We're not going to be using any AXD files, but I'm going to leave that ignore route in there in case down the road you needed to take advantage of one of them. And, well, it would be problematic if you weren't ignoring that route, because if you don't ignore the route, ASP.NET MVC will try to map it to something, override everything else, and it won't get to its destination.
So we're not going to use it, but it's better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it thing.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
Next up, we have our infamous default route.
What have you done?
We're going to talk about the default route when we go ahead and create an area. For the front end, I am not going to use the default route. Instead, what I'm going to do is every single individual URL that we can type into our application, like for example, we're going to have like posts or something, or /login or /admin. All this stuff I'm going to make explicit for the front end. The reason I'm going to do that is twofold. First of all, I really want to explain how to write your own routes. And second of all, when you do things on the front end and you don't use the default route, you get more control over the way your URLs look. The way your URLs work are important for SEO purposes as well as if you had a RESTful web service.
Gotcha.
So every single page that can be loaded by the application will, for the front end, not for the admin, but for the front end, will have an explicit entry in our register routes method that describes to ASP.NET MVC how to get to the controller that it needs. So let's go ahead and define one. I'm going to start off with, what am I going to start off? I'm going to start with the home page. That sounds like a pretty straightforward place to start.
Yeah, seems like it.
So I'm going to go routes dot, I'm going to say map route, and then I'm going to look at this function, this method. This method has quite a few different overloads, but at the base, they take in a name and a URL. They can also take in default parameters. They can take in constraints. They can take in namespaces, or pretty much any combination of that. Every route needs a name, and every route name needs to be unique. I'm going to call this route home. The cool thing about this route is that by naming it home, whenever I want to generate a link to this route, I just have to tell it the name home, and it knows where to go. even if I change the actual URL that this route points to down the road. It gives us a lot of flexibility. The next step is to define the URL. Obviously, we need to, the first step is to say, okay, we want this specific URL to go to this controller. This part is where we define what the URL looks like. The home route is going to have an empty URL. Why? Because it's going to be the route that is executed when we don't have anything following the website. It's the home page. Therefore, the URL is blank.
Okay.
Next up, we have our defaults. Our defaults are incredibly important, especially when we're defining custom routes. The defaults come in the form of an anonymous object. What do I mean by that? Well, hopefully you guys have seen examples of anonymous objects. It's where you, or anonymous types rather, it's where you use the new keyword followed by an open and closed curly and define properties inside of it, despite the fact we don't have a corresponding class. What it allows us to do, in this case, we'll see a better example of defaults later, but our defaults allow us to specify the controller and the action. Now, we haven't talked about actions yet, but we are definitely going to get into them very shortly here when we create the corresponding controller for home. So how do I do that? I simply say controller equals, and I'm going to say pages. I want, or sorry, not pages, I want to say posts. I want the default route, the main URL, to be routed to the posts controller. And I want the action to be index. And again, we haven't talked about actions yet, but it'll be very clear very shortly. Now, this is actually the bare minimum of what we need. We will be extending this later on in this video to include a parameter passing in our namespaces, but we can't talk about those just yet because we haven't seen an example of a controller. So I'm going to close this and terminate the line. Okay, so here's something really important to understand about ASP.NET MVC, and something that will really frustrate everyone who is watching this video who hasn't used it before. And I'm sorry to say this is just how it is. It actually does make sense if you think about it. The changes I just wrote in code are not going to take effect on the website. That's because ASP.NET MVC is compiled. It's actually compiled into DLLs that are located in the bin folder of our project. As you see, there's a simple blog.dll. This is a compiled assembly that is the result of compiling this project, goes into this assembly, and then this assembly is picked up by ASP.NET. What does that all mean for you? That means for you, whenever you edit a CS file, whenever you edit any code, any backend code, we'll talk about exceptions to this rule later when we get into views, but whenever you edit any controller or model code, you must recompile the application. You must tell the C# compiler to take all of our code, turn it into a DLL. When that happens, IIS Express will notice that the DLL has been updated, and it'll restart our application for us. So what's the easiest way to recompile? Well, we could hit Control F5, that'll do it. An easier way, however, if our web server is already running, which it is, we can simply hit F6. By hitting F6, and I'll show you the menu button for that if you're more of a menu guy, you go up to Build, and you say Build Solution. That is F6. By doing that, we see down here that the build was successful, which means that C# turned all of our CS files into the DLL, placed it into the bin folder. IIS Express noticed that the file was changed, restarted the application with the new code in it, and is now ready to be used. So what do you think will happen if I come back here to my website, Steve, and hit refresh?
I think you're still going to have that.
Yep. And okay. I'm assuming you know why?
Because we started that code, but we really still haven't told it to do anything.
Exactly. We told it that we want to route all requests to the homepage, to the posts controller and the index action, but we don't actually have a posts controller or an index action. So let's go ahead and create one. Remember, I can place this controller anywhere that I want in my project, but I'm going to place it in the controllers folder because that's what makes sense. I'm going to right click, go to add, and I can say add controller. I'm actually not going to do that. I'm going to say new item, and I'm going to add in a class. The reason I'm adding a class in manually is I don't want to use the new controller just yet, because I want to show you guys what is included with that template. So let's build a controller from scratch. The name of this, what do you think the name is going to be? Well, actually, there's no reason why you should know. It's a ASP.NET MVC thing. It's not actually posts.
Darn, because I was going to say posts.
Close though. It's posts controller.
That makes sense.
Yeah. The name of the controller, the class that is associated with the controller name, always ends with the word controller. And then I'll hit enter. I now have a public class posts controller inside my controller's namespace. It's not yet a controller. To make it a controller, I have to have it inherit from the controller base class. Well, notice that will actually error out when I type in controller. That's because I haven't imported the correct type yet with the using statement. So I'm going to do this once slowly for everyone, and in the future I'm going to be using ReSharper to import this namespace for me. So just note, when you create a controller, you have to add in or you don't have to, but it's highly recommended to, add in a system.web.mvc using statement. By importing this package, we now have access to the controller class, which we can now inherit from. Okay, that is actually all we need to do to make a controller. I can hit F6, and if we come back here, guess what we're going to see?
Same thing.
Same thing. That's because I haven't created the index action. I've created the controller, which matches up with this, but I haven't created the actual index action that'll be invoked. So what's an action? Well, a controller you can think about as a class, and an action you can think about as a method. Remember, classes can have multiple methods. So controller contains a variety of actions. Actions are what we can route to. So how do we make an action? Well, we make a method, but it has to follow a special signature. We're going to make a public. It needs to be public. It's going to return an action result. The name of the method is going to be the name of the action. And in this case, we're not going to take in any parameters, but we'll talk about that a little bit more. So now we have a public action result index. This is an action. This is the index action. But we're not done yet, because if I hit F6, we'll get a compiler error. Whoops. We'll hit a compiler error saying that our action doesn't actually return a result. So how do we return an action result? Well, an action result is just a class. We can make custom action results if we want. ASP.NET MVC is very flexible in that regard. But the base controller class actually gives us a lot of built-in methods that construct special action results for us. There's quite a few of them, but there's only one of them that we're going to be talking about in this video. And that is content. An example of other action results are the redirect family of action results. These methods return action results that redirect to specific routes or other things. We have the file action result. The file action result serves a file from the web server. We have the view action result. View action result renders a view. We'll be using this a lot. And that's really the big ones that you need to be worried about. But we'll return content for now. The content method simply takes in the string content and optionally a content type and a content encoding. We're just going to send in a string called hello world. We're going to terminate that line, and then we're going to hit F6. Coming back into our web browser and hitting refresh, we'll see that we now have hello world.
That's awesome.
Yep. So that's our posts controller, or you can consider this to be the home page of the application. We're going to need a couple more controllers, and I'm just going to add them in, just returning basic content for the sole purpose of getting some more examples of routes into place, so you guys can get some practice in. We're still obviously going to be using these later down the line, but in this video we're not actually going to be writing any views just yet. So let's write our login route. I'm going to leave the home route on the bottom. And I'm going to say routes, map route. I'm going to name the route login. The URL is going to be login. I'm going to pass in the defaults with the controller of auth and an action of login. Then I'm going to terminate the line. Now, you might be looking at the URL and thinking that doesn't really look like a URL, but it is. This URL will match /login. Will match. Obviously, that'll take me to a 404 in this case because, well, I haven't recompiled the code, but or added the controller. But still, this is the URL that's going to match there. You might be sometimes tempted to put a / in the URL. I think that looks a little bit nicer, honestly, but that'll actually cause an error. You can't have / in the URLs. At least
gotcha.
You can't have them at the beginning. I could say login /woe/ble if I wanted to, but I can't say /login. So, anyway. So that's our login route. Again, if I were to recompile and reload my web server, we would still get a 404. So let's create a controller. This time I'm going to right-click controllers, say add, and I'm going to say controller. Then I'm going to type in auth. So we're creating an auth controller. For the scaffolding, I'm going to say empty MVC controller. Alternatively, I could create API controllers for Web API, or I can make a controller with a bunch of stubs for reading and writing data. I'm never going to use any of these in this particular video. Instead, I'm going to always use the empty MVC controller. Then I'm going to hit add. What do we get? We get exactly what we did with the posts controller, as in we get a class that inherits from controller, we get our using statement up here, and we get one action called index automatically put into our class with a return of view. I'm going to delete that since we don't want this action. We want the login action. So I'm going to say public. I'm going to use ReSharper shortcut here. I'm going to type in capital AR space. ReSharper has a cool autocomplete feature where if you type in the letters that correspond to the capital letters of an identifier, it will automatically highlight it. So we see action result is already highlighted because I typed in AR. It's really nice.
That's very nice, yeah.
And I use it quite frequently. So if you ever see me like quickly hammer out action result, that's because I just type in AR space. I've been using ASP.NET MVC since 2009. You can't imagine how many action results I've typed in since then. Okay, so the name of our action is login, and again, it has to return something. We're going to return content. Now I'm going to hit F6 to reload our application. Come back over here, refresh. We now have a login action. So, how are you feeling so far, Steve?
Not too bad. I mean, except for me not actually knowing C#. I'm following the logic of why you're doing what you're doing.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go ahead and create an area. So what's an area? You think of an area like a namespace. It's a way to, well, group its own collection of views, controllers, and potentially models as well. It's a way to group it both on the file system and in the URL. So if I right-click Simple Blog, I can go to Add, and I can say Area. So remember, right-click the project, Add Area. Then we get an area name. The name of our area is going to be Admin, because this is going to contain all the controllers that we use to add posts, modify posts, and add users. So I'm going to add this area, and what do I get? Well, a couple things happened. First of all, an areas folder appeared underneath admin. That obviously corresponds to the name of the area I made. Next up, we have another group of controllers, models, and views. We're not going to be talking about views in this video, so I'll go ahead and collapse that. Finally, we have an area admin registration. The area registrations will automatically be discovered by ASP.NET MVC, and they effectively allow me to namespace a group of controllers and views into a special name, such as, in this case, admin. I want to separate all my admin code from all my front-end code. I mean, that makes sense, right?
Yeah. I mean, this is kind of like if this application is a house, this is a room.
Right.
Gotcha.
first thing I'm going to do is I really don't like how that's formatted. It just really bugs me, sorry. I'm also going to rename admin to underscore or lowercase admin. Again, it's just I just prefer anything that has anything to do with generating URLs to be lowercase. Unfortunately, that won't happen all the time, but we can try. Okay, we'll see we have a register area method. This is where we register routes that are specific to this area. I'm actually going to leave this default here. This happens to be very similar to the default route I deleted earlier out of our front end, but in this case I'm going to leave it. The interesting thing about this route is that it's admin slash, first of all. That comes from our area. The reason why our area is namespaced is simply because, which I'm also going to make lowercase, the reason our area is namespaced like this is because we created an area called admin, so all the URLs are going to be through admin. Now we'll see some interesting syntax. We have controller wrapped with curlies, action wrapped with curlies, and ID wrapped with curlies. These are parameters that the ASP.NET routing engine can extract from the URL in order to create data that can be passed into our application. But you'll notice it's interesting that we have a variable controller and a variable action and a variable ID. You'll also notice that in our defaults, we have action equals index. So let's see how this route works. I'm not actually going to create any controllers just yet. I just want to show you some examples of how this route works, because it might be a little bit magical to some people. First of all, this route will only be matched if it starts with admin, as you can see there on line 13. Next, we have to do a slash, and we can put in anything we want, actually. We can put in that. It doesn't matter. ASP.NET will match that. But what it'll do is it'll match this. This corresponds to the controller, and it'll use that as the name of the controller. So in reality, the default route is a convenience because it allows me to not have to manually specify the routes to every single controller in action. Instead, I can follow what's called a convention. So the convention in this case is I can say if I wanted to go to the new action on the posts controller, I can simply do admin posts new. How does that work? Well, we have the admin, which is required, again on line 13. Our controller is pulled out of the second thing divided by slashes, which is going to be the posts controller, so that's what it's going to become, without even specifying it in the defaults. Then our action is pulled out of the final parameter we passed in and is used for the action for routing purposes. So this route will correspond to the new action on the posts controller in the admin area. And it does that because of the way this is defined here. What do you think action controller pair would happen if I went to admin posts?
I don't know. Is it going to not do anything?
It will do something. For a route to work, it needs a controller and an action. But you'll notice I didn't supply an action here in this route through the route pattern. However, the route defaults specify that action equals index.
So it'll default to index.
Right. So admin posts will default to the index action on the posts controller. Next up we have ID. ID is just an arbitrary anything, really. So if I said admin posts edit /43, that doesn't have any impact on the way that this route is routed, but it's a parameter that I can pick up from the action. We'll see an example of that later. Okay, so we have admin, but again, it's going to be 404ing because we don't have any corresponding controllers. So let's actually go ahead and create a posts controller on the admin area. Now, this is going to be a little bit fun. Actually, no. Let's start off with users controller. Let's see one that'll work first, and then let's do the one that'll break. Okay, so I made basically I created a new class called users controller. I added a public action result index method to it that returns the content of users. That now means I can go to admin, users, and I get users. Alternatively, what's the other way I can access this action, you think, Steve?
Okay. Wow, man, you're burying my brain. Stop laughing at me. Let's see. Return content action result index.
I want to get to the index action. There's two ways to get to it. The first way is taking advantage of the default. The second way is being explicit and saying /index.
Wow, I was really trying to overthink that.
Yeah, that's that.
You set me up.
Apparently, I'm really good at that. All right. So there's two ways to get to this route, and that's awesome. I'm going to define one more action controller pair in this video because, I mean, obviously we're not doing anything useful with them just quite yet until we talk about views. But this one's important. This one's incredibly important. I'm going to create a posts controller. We have a problem. So I created a post controller. Again, it's just a class that inherits from controller in my controller's namespace, and it has a public action result index method. But we have a very, very, very big problem. We'll see an example of that very, very, very big problem if we try to go to our home page. Fortunately, ASP.NET MVC has gotten a whole lot better with its error messages over the years. So if you read through this in its entirety, it should be you should be able to figure it out. But I'll go ahead and tell you guys how to fix it. The problem is that you do not think of controllers as having to exist in a particular folder. Instead, ASP.NET effectively flattens every single controller it finds in our project into a single list, regardless of its namespace. What does that mean? Well, it means if we have two posts controllers, even if they're in different namespaces and different folders and different areas, they still conflict, and ASP.NET MVC has no idea which one you actually mean. There's a very simple way to fix it. It's built into the actual framework itself. I'm going to open back up my route config file, and I'm going to look back at my map route method. Look at the signature of it. Notice how it has a string array namespaces argument, or parameter, sorry. If we pass in a namespace, an array of strings that represent the namespaces we only want this route to go to, we can make ASP.NET MVC not confused about which one of the posts controllers we're intending to go into. Just to recap, when we're hitting the home route, we want to go into the posts controller that is out here under controllers. If we go to the admin posts, we get admin post because it's more specific and namespaced by our area, and because of that, we see that that properly works and gives us our admin post controller. So now that we're back into the home page, let's go ahead and fix that. I'm just going to go ahead and create a var namespaces local variable, and I'm going to assign it to a new array. Then I'm going to say type of posts controller. Now, it's important to note that when I hit enter, I'm going to be importing the simpleblog.controllers namespace. So watch this. I hit enter, and simpleblog.controllers appears here on line 7 because we need that using statement. Then I'm going to say dot namespace. So this code simply says I want a local variable that's an array of strings that contains one item, and its one item is the namespace of wherever our posts controller class exists. Now that I have this in a variable, I'm going to pass it in to both of our map routes. This way, these routes are namespaced specifically to this folder. That is the only place ASP.NET MVC is going to look for our controllers when they are accessed through the front end. If I go ahead and hit F6, again that's important, come back here and hit refresh, we'll see that we now see our posts controller on the front end, but if we were to go to admin/posts, we see our admin posts on the back end as well, which correspond to completely different controllers in different areas.
So basically, this is one of those places where its versatility is awesome, but now we got to do this extra stuff for it to know what's going on.
Right. It's so flexible that it allows us to have controllers anywhere in our project, even in different projects. But that comes with the caveat of us having to tell it where to find controllers when they conflict.
Gotcha.
Okay, so I think that about wraps up the introduction to routes, controllers, and actions. The last thing that I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to jump over here to source tree, go into my file status, and look at all the files that I added and edited. Notice how we have our route config that I modified. We have our simpleblog.cs proj. This was modified because we added files. And we also have our new controllers. And a new web config that was plopped into our areas admin views. I'm going to go ahead and commit all of these by going to somewhere.
There it is.
Control-Shift-C. I think I'm just going to use that from now on. And then I'm going to say added basic routes and controllers and the admin area. Hit commit. I forgot to stage everything.
We got to stage them first, don't we?
Yeah. Okay. There. I staged everything, and now I'm committing them. And now it's committed. I can verify it's committed by going to log history and seeing our commit right there. So again, if I wanted to see what our route config looked like before all of this, I can go back to initial commit and see that information right there. And there's our default route that I nuked. All right, that wraps up the introduction to areas, controllers, and routes. There's a lot more fun stuff you can do with all of the things we have shown here, and we will get to take advantage of that fun stuff later on. But unfortunately, you need a really basic understanding in order to continue, which is why we had this video.
Well, let's get on to the next one because my brain's not entirely broken yet.
Awesome.